If this man had died at birth, the United States would not exist. That is not an exaggeration. It is a historical fact. Without his diplomacy, France never sends the guns. Without the guns, Washington hangs. Without Washington, the revolution dies in the cradle. We like to talk about the Founding Fathers as a group, but Benjamin Franklin was the foundation itself. He was the architect of our mind, the inventor of our style, and the savior of our war. But the price of creating a nation was the destruction of his own soul. He conquered the lightning. He conquered the courts of Europe. But he could never conquer the tragedy within his own home. But long before he saved the world, he had to survive his own neighborhood. Boston in the early 18th century was not a place for free thinkers. It was a city on a hill, built by Puritans who had fled England not just to practice their religion, but to enforce it. It was a theocracy in all but name. The day began with prayer. The week revolved around the Sabbath, and the year was measured by the mercy or the wrath of God. Life here was fragile. Smallpox stalked the narrow alleys. Fires frequently consumed entire neighborhoods, and the French and their Native American allies were a constant, terrifying shadow on the frontier. In this frozen, pious outpost, a child was born on a Sunday, January 17, 1706. Josiah Franklin, the father, was a candle and soap maker. He was a sturdy, pious man who had emigrated from England, carrying the heavy Calvinist belief that God had a specific plan for every soul. And God's plan for Josiah seemed to be to fill the earth. Benjamin was the 15th of 17 children. In a house that smelled perpetually of rendering animal fat, the sickening, cloying scent of tallow used to make candles, there was no privacy. There was no silence. You had to shout to be heard. You had to fight for a scrap of bread at the dinner table. On the very day he was born, Josiah bundled the infant Benjamin up and carried him across the snowy street to the Old South meeting house to be baptized. Josiah had a specific plan for this boy. As his 10th son, he decided to tithe Benjamin to the Lord. He was not born to be a scientist or a statesman. He was destined for the pulpit. However, the plan for the ministry didn't last long. Josiah sent 8-year-old Ben to the Boston Latin School, the training ground for the elite. Ben was brilliant. He rose to the top of his class immediately, but he failed math, and more importantly, Josiah realized he couldn't afford the tuition. So at the age of 10, Ben was pulled out of school. His formal education was over. For the rest of his life, the man who founded universities and libraries, the man who debated the greatest philosophers of Europe, would have only 2 years of formal schooling. Everything else he would have to steal for himself. He was put to work in his father's shop, the Blue Ball. Day in, day out, he cut wicks. He filled molds. He attended the shop. He smelled of grease, and he hated it. He loathed it with a passion that terrified his father. Benjamin looked at the harbor just streets away. He saw the tall masts of the ships bound for England, for the West Indies, for places where the air didn't smell of dead animals. He watched the sailors, men with weathered faces and stories of storms and strange lands, and he told his father, "I want to go to sea." For Josiah, this was a nightmare. He had already lost one son who had run away to sea and never returned. He wasn't going to lose his youngest, brightest boy to the ocean. To keep him grounded, Josiah took Ben on a tour of the tradesmen of Boston. They visited joiners, bricklayers, turners, and braziers. Josiah hoped the boy would see the dignity in building things and working with his hands. And Ben did learn something. He learned how to use tools. He learned that he liked to tinker, to experiment, to figure out how things worked. But he didn't want to be a bricklayer. He was hungry, but not for food. He was hungry for words. He spent every penny he could scrounge on books. He read Pilgrim's Progress, Plutarch's Lives, and essays by Defoe. He read them, memorized them, and sold them to buy new ones. Josiah watched this, saw the boy devouring the written word while neglecting the candle wax, and had an idea. There was another trade that involved words, a trade that required a sharp eye and a quick hand. His older son, James Franklin, had just returned from London with a printing press. At the age of 12, Benjamin signed away his freedom. He was bound as an apprentice to his brother James until the age of 21, 9 years of servitude. In the eyes of the law, he was the property of his master. The fact that the master was his brother only made it more complicated. James Franklin was a pioneer, but he was also a tyrant. He was hot-tempered and jealous. He treated Ben not as a brother, but as a lowly underling. But the print shop was also a paradise. It was the internet of the 18th century. It was where information flowed. Ben was surrounded by newspapers, pamphlets, and political arguments. He learned to set type, picking the tiny metal letters backwards and placing them into the stick. It taught him spelling, grammar, and the structure of language. While the other apprentices were eating heavy stews and drinking ale, Ben was eating a handful of raisins, drinking water, and sharpening his mind like a blade. He barely slept. He read Locke on human understanding. He read The Spectator, a witty London magazine. He was obsessed with the writing style, elegant, satirical, rational. He decided he wanted to write like that, but he knew his own writing was clunky and rough. So he invented a training regimen for himself. He would read an essay, put it away, and try to rewrite it from memory. Then he would compare his version to the original, spot his mistakes, and do it again. He turned words into verse to learn rhythm, then turned them back into prose to learn structure. Then in 1721, James Franklin launched a newspaper, the New England Courant. This was a watershed moment. Before this, newspapers were dull sheets reprinted by authority of the government. The Courant was different. It was the first independent newspaper in the colonies, and it was rebellious. James and his friends, a group of freethinkers called the Hellfire Club, used the paper to attack the establishment. Ben was right in the middle of it. He was the one typesetting the attacks. He listened to the men debating in the shop. He saw that the pen was a weapon. You could use ink to bring down giants. He wanted to join the fight. He wanted to write for the Courant, but he knew James would never publish anything written by his little brother. James saw him as a grunt, a servant. So Ben decided to use a trick. In April 1722, Ben created a character, not a man, not a rebel, but a woman, a middle-aged widow named Silence Dogood. She was the perfect Trojan horse. He wrote the first letter in disguised handwriting and slid it under the door of the print shop at night. James and his friends loved it. They thought it was brilliant. They speculated on who this Silence Dogood could be. Was it a prominent merchant? A learned scholar? They published it. And Boston loved her too. Over the next 6 months, Ben wrote 14 letters. Silence. Dogood mocked the sheer vanity of Bostonians. She mocked the students at Harvard, calling them dunces who only learned how to be arrogant. It was the debut of Benjamin Franklin's genius. He was trying on a mask. He realized that if he wanted to tell the truth, it was often safer and more effective to do it pretending to be someone else. But pride is a dangerous thing. As the letters became the talk of the town, Ben couldn't hold it in anymore. One day he confessed, "I am Silence Dogood." James was stunned. The Hellfire Club was impressed, but James was humiliated. His apprentice, his little brother, had fooled him. He had proven he was smarter than the master. The beatings got worse. The relationship disintegrated. James was not just a harsh brother, he was a political target. The authorities finally cracked down on the Courant and threw James in jail for contempt. While James was in jail, 17-year-old Ben took over the paper. For a few weeks, he was the boss. He kept the rebellion alive. He tasted freedom. When James was released, the government forbade him from printing the paper. So James came up with a scheme. He would officially cancel Ben's apprentice contract so the paper could be printed under the name Benjamin Franklin, a free man, to bypass the law. But in secret, James made Ben sign a new contract, binding him for the remaining years. It was a secret deal, and that was James's mistake. One day, after a particularly brutal argument, Ben made a calculation. He knew that if he ran away, James couldn't sue him or call the authorities. To do so, James would have to produce the secret contract, which would prove to the government that he had lied about the paper's ownership. James was trapped by his own deception. Ben was free, but running away was still dangerous. In 1723, a runaway apprentice was a fugitive. Notices would be posted, rewards would be offered. He could be arrested and dragged back in chains. He couldn't leave by land. His father and brother would catch him. He had to go by sea. He found a friend to lie for him, telling a ship captain that Ben had gotten a naughty girl with child and needed to leave town quietly. It was a lie, but it worked. In late September 1723, Benjamin Franklin boarded a sloop. He watched the spires of Boston, the city of Cotton Mather, the city of his father, the city of candles and sermons, fade into the mist. He was 17. He had very little money. He knew no one outside of Boston. He was sailing into the void. The journey was a nightmare. His boat to New Jersey was caught in a squall. The sails were torn to ribbons, and a drunken passenger fell overboard. Ben had to haul him back by the hair. They spent 30 hours wet, cold, and drifting without food or water. When he finally landed in New Jersey, he had to walk 50 miles across the state. It was raining. He was bedraggled. People looked at him with suspicion, thinking he was a runaway servant, which technically he was. He fell ill with a fever. He remembered reading that drinking copious amounts of cold water could cure a fever. He drank water until he couldn't move, sweated it out in a roadside inn, and kept walking. He finally reached the Delaware River and found a boat going to Philadelphia. Arriving at the Market Street Wharf on a Sunday morning in October, Benjamin Franklin stepped onto the wharf in Philadelphia with $1 Dutch and about a shilling in copper coin. He was dirty, exhausted, and starving. He walked up Market Street and found a bakery. He asked for 3 pennies worth of bread. In Boston, that would get you a small slice. In Philadelphia, the bread was cheap and plentiful. The baker handed him 3 massive, puffy rolls. He didn't have anywhere to put them, so with a roll under each arm and eating the third, he wandered up the street. He looked ridiculous. A young girl named Deborah Reed was standing in the doorway of her father's house. She saw this disheveled, awkward boy with the bread and laughed out loud. It was a comical sight. She had no way of knowing she was looking at her future husband, and he had no way of knowing that he had just walked into the city that he would transform into the capital of a new nation. He kept walking until he saw people entering a large building. It was a Quaker meeting house. He followed them inside. There was no sermon, no shouting minister, just silence. The warmth of the room and the exhaustion overtook him. Benjamin Franklin, the runaway, the rebel, the boy who would one day harness the lightning, closed his eyes and fell fast asleep. He had escaped the past. Now he had to build a future. When Benjamin Franklin woke up in that Quaker meeting house, he was a nobody. He was just another drifter in a city of strangers. But Philadelphia in the 1720s was a place of fluid opportunity, a stark contrast to the rigid hierarchy of Boston. Here, a man was judged not by his father's rank, but by his own industry, and Franklin had industry in spades. He quickly found work with a printer named Samuel Keimer, a peculiar bearded eccentric who kept the Sabbath on Saturday and tried to found a new religion. Franklin, with his superior training from Boston, quickly became the most valuable asset in the shop. But his talent attracted dangerous attention. Sir William Keith, the governor of Pennsylvania, took a liking to the young man. Keith was a smooth talker, a politician who loved to make grand promises he had no intention of keeping. He took the 18-year-old Franklin aside and proposed a dazzling idea. Franklin should go to London, buy the best equipment, and return to set up his own print shop as the official government printer. Keith promised to write letters of credit to fund the whole expedition. For a teenager, this was intoxicating. The governor himself was backing him. So in 1724, Franklin boarded a ship for London, believing his fortune was made. He was sailing on a fool's errand. When the ship docked in London, Franklin discovered the truth. Governor Keith had never written the letters. There was no money. There was no credit. He was stranded in the largest, most overwhelming city in the world, 3,000 miles from home with no friends and barely any coin. Most young men would have panicked. Franklin simply went to work. London in the 1720s was a sensory overload, a sprawling, smoky metropolis of coffee houses, theaters, gin lanes, and intellectual ferment. Franklin found a job at Palmer's, one of the most prestigious printing houses in London, located in a converted church. It was here that Franklin's physical prowess became legendary. The British printers were heavy drinkers. They drank a pint of beer before breakfast, a pint at breakfast, a pint between breakfast and dinner, and so on. They believed the beer gave them strength. Franklin drank only water. They mocked him, calling him the Water American. But when Franklin could carry 2 heavy trays of lead type up the stairs, one in each hand, while the beer drinkers struggled with one, the mockery stopped. He was proving a point that would stick with him forever. Temperance was not just a moral virtue, it was a competitive advantage. But London was also a playground for his mind. He wrote a radical philosophical pamphlet titled A Dissertation on Liberty and Necessity, Pleasure and Pain. It was a cold, purely logical argument stating that if God is all-powerful, then everything that happens is God's will, and therefore there is no such thing as sin or vice. It was the kind of intellectual exercise a clever young man writes to show off. Devoid of emotional wisdom, he would later burn most copies of it, calling it one of the errata or mistakes of his life. He realized that while pure logic might work in a pamphlet, it didn't work in the real world where human actions had consequences. He also had a wild side. He befriended a young man named James Ralph, and together they explored the nightlife of London. Franklin was a swimmer in an era when most people feared the water. On one occasion, he stripped down and swam from Chelsea to Blackfriars, performing aquatic tricks for a boat full of spectators. He was so good that a wealthy man offered to pay him to travel Europe as a swimming instructor. For a moment, Benjamin Franklin considered becoming a professional swimmer. Imagine how history would have changed if he had said yes. But the pull of home was stronger. In 1726, a Quaker merchant named Thomas Denham offered Franklin a job as a clerk back in Philadelphia. Franklin accepted. On the long voyage home, staring at the endless Atlantic, the 20-year-old Franklin had a spiritual crisis. He realized he had been drifting intellectually and morally. He took out his pen and wrote a plan of conduct. He resolved to live frugally, to speak the truth, and to work hard. It was the moment he decided to stop being a clever boy and start being a serious man. Tragedy greeted him upon his return. His patron, Mr. Denham, died shortly after they arrived. Franklin was once again unemployed. Even worse, the girl he had courted, Deborah Red, had married someone else. When Franklin had left for London, he had been casual about their relationship, writing her only one letter in 2 years. heartbroken, and abandoned, Deborah had been pushed by her mother into marrying a potter named John Rogers. It was a disaster. Rogers was a drunkard and a thief who soon ran away to the West Indies to escape his debts, leaving Deborah in a terrible limbo. She was technically married, but her husband was gone. She couldn't remarry because no one knew if Rogers was dead or alive. Franklin looked at the pain in her eyes and knew it was partly his fault. He carried the guilt of his neglect. Franklin returned to the printing trade, but this time with a ferocious focus. In 1727, he gathered a group of 12 men, tradesmen, scriveners, and artisans, and formed a club called the Junto. This was the engine of his rise. They met on Friday evenings to discuss morals, politics, and natural philosophy, but it was also a mutual aid society. They asked questions like, has any citizen failed in his business, and what was the cause? Have you lately heard of any citizens thriving well, and by what means? It was a mastermind group, a network of up-and-comers who supported each other's businesses. With the backing of the Junto, Franklin bought a failing newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, in 1729. It was a dull, dying rag. Franklin transformed it. He used his wit, his satire, and his supreme skill as a writer to make it the most readable paper in America. He didn't just report the news, he shaped it. When a competitor tried to put him out of business, Franklin would wheel a wheelbarrow full of paper through the streets himself, just to show the town how hard-working he was. He cultivated an image of relentless industry. As he famously wrote, I took care not only to be in reality industrious and frugal, but to avoid all appearances to the contrary. But he needed more than a newspaper. In 1732, he launched Poor Richard's Almanac. Almanacs were the best sellers of the day, filled with weather predictions and crop advice. Franklin created a persona, Richard Saunders, a henpecked husband who was too poor to buy his own almanac. He filled the margins with the witty aphorisms we know today. Fish and visitors stink in 3 days. Keep your eyes wide open before marriage, half shut afterwards. It was a smash hit. Poor Richard made Franklin wealthy. It turned him from a local printer into a colonial celebrity. With wealth came the ability to shape his city. Franklin looked at Philadelphia and saw problems that needed fixing. There were no books. He founded the Library Company of Philadelphia, the first subscription library in America. Houses were burning down. He organized the Union Fire Company. The streets were dark and dangerous. He organized a night watch and improved street lighting. He didn't wait for the government to solve problems. He mobilized citizens to solve them themselves. He was inventing the very concept of American civic society, yet his personal life remained complicated. In 1730, he rectified his erratum with Deborah Reed. Since she couldn't legally divorce her runaway husband, Franklin simply moved in with her. It was a common law marriage, scandalous for the time. Deborah was not an intellectual match for Ben. She didn't care for his philosophy or his politics. But she was a formidable partner. She ran the stationer's shop attached to the printing house, managed the accounts, and provided the stability he desperately needed. But there was a shadow in the house. Around the time he settled down with Deborah, Franklin brought home a baby, a boy named William. William Franklin was illegitimate. To this day, we do not know who his mother was. Some historians speculate it was a maid, a prostitute, or a woman Franklin wanted to protect. Franklin simply acknowledged the boy as his own and demanded that Deborah raise him. It was a tremendous request. Imagine the humiliation for Deborah, raising her husband's bastard child in her own home. But she did it. She was stern with the boy, but she raised him. And Benjamin? He doted on William. He saw himself in the boy. He gave him the best education, the best clothes, the best opportunities. It was an intense, exclusive bond between father and son, forged in a secret that they shared against the world. By 1748, at the age of 42, Benjamin Franklin was a rich man. He had franchises of his printing business from New York to Charleston. He was the postmaster of Philadelphia. He was a clerk of the assembly. He had achieved everything a tradesman could hope for. Most men would have retired to a country estate to drink wine and count their money, but Franklin was restless. He felt he had spent the first part of his life making money, and now he wanted to spend the rest of it making himself useful to humanity. He looked at his business partner, David Hall, and made a decision. He signed a partnership agreement handing over the daily operations of the printing empire to Hall. Franklin was retiring from business, but he wasn't retiring from work. He moved to a new house on a quiet street. He set up a laboratory. He had received a strange glass tube from a friend in London, along with a letter describing some curious experiments with electric fire. The printer laid down his composing stick. The politician set aside his ledger. The man who had conquered the world of words was now turning his eyes to the invisible forces of nature. He was about to try and catch a ghost in a jar. Benjamin Franklin was about to become the most famous wizard in the world. In 1748, the house on the corner of 2nd and Ray Streets became the most dangerous place in America. To the casual passerby, it was just the residence of the retired printer, Mr. Franklin. But inside, it was a wizard's lair. Having stepped away from the daily grind of business, Franklin turned his voracious mind toward a mystery that was baffling the greatest intellects of Europe: electricity. At the time, electricity was little more than a parlor trick, a curiosity used by traveling showmen to make feathers dance or to give ladies a surprising shock. It was magic without meaning. Franklin, however, suspected it was a fundamental force of the universe, and he was determined to master it. He transformed his library into a laboratory. The room was cluttered with glass tubes, silk rubs, wax plates, and Leyden jars, primitive capacitors that could store a charge. He invited his friends to witness electric parties. They were raucous affairs. Franklin, ever the showman, would electrify a spider made of cork so it would jump around, or set up a game where a king and a queen on a picture frame would give a shock if you touched their gilded crowns. He even attempted to electrocute a turkey for dinner, noting that the birds died uncommonly quiet. On one occasion, he accidentally took the charge himself. He described the feeling as a universal blow that shook him from head to foot, leaving him numb and confused, a stark reminder that he was playing with a force that could kill him. But through the games, he was observing. He realized that electricity was not created by friction, but rather collected. He theorized that it was a single fluid that flowed from one place to another. If an object had too much, it was positive. If it had too little, it was negative. These terms, positive, negative, battery, conductor, charge, were coined by Franklin in that Philadelphia study. He was literally inventing the language of modern physics. And as he experimented, he began to form a terrifying hypothesis. The sparks jumping from his knuckles were the same substance as the lightning bolts that shattered church steeples. It was a radical idea. For millennia, lightning was the weapon of God, the divine artillery. To suggest it was merely a large spark was heresy. To suggest it could be drawn down and tamed was madness. But Franklin was not a man of dogma. He was a man of data. In 1750, he proposed an experiment. He described a sentry box to be built on a high tower, with a metal rod extending into the storm clouds to draw down the electric fire. He wrote up his theories and sent them to his pen pals in London. The Royal Society laughed at him. They thought the ideas of this provincial American were absurd, but the French didn't laugh. King Louis XV saw the paper and demanded the experiment be tried. On May 10th, 1752, outside Paris, a French scientist named Thomas Francois Dalibard set up the sentry box exactly as Franklin had described. A storm rolled in. Thunder shook the ground. Dalibard's assistant reached out to the metal rod with a wine bottle, and a massive blue spark snapped through the air with the smell of sulfur. The Frenchman fell back, terrified and ecstatic. He wrote to the king, "Franklin is right." Back in Philadelphia, Franklin had no idea he was already the most famous scientist in Europe. He was tired of waiting for a high tower to be built in Philadelphia, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. In June 1752, a heavy thunderstorm darkened the skies over the city. Franklin took his son William, now a tall, strapping young man of 21, and they went out into a field. They didn't have a tower, but they had a silk kite tipped with a metal wire and a key tied to the string. This is the moment history freezes. The father and the illegitimate son, standing shoulder to shoulder in the driving rain, united by a dangerous secret. They were hunting a monster. As the storm raged, Franklin touched his knuckle to the key. He felt the spark. He saw the fibers of the hemp string stand on end. He charged a laden jar from the clouds. It was done. He had connected the heavens to the earth. He had proven that the sky was full of electricity. The practical application was immediate, the lightning rod. A simple iron spike sharpened to a point, connected to a wire running into the ground. It could silently drain the charge from a cloud or safely conduct a strike into the earth, sparing the building. It was a miracle of engineering, but it was also a theological earthquake. Pastors preached against Franklin's rods, claiming it was presumptuous to interfere with God's weather. Franklin's response was characteristically dry. Surely the thunder of heaven is no more supernatural than the rain, hail, or sunshine of heaven, against which we hedge and roof our houses. He had secularized the storm. Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, would later call him the new Prometheus, the man who stole fire from the gods. Fame crashed down upon him. Harvard and Yale gave him honorary degrees. The Royal Society in London, which had mocked him, apologized and gave him their highest medal. He was now Dr. Franklin. But just as he reached the pinnacle of the scientific world, the political world dragged him back down into the mud. The American colonies were fracturing. To the west, the French and their Native American allies were encroaching on the frontier, burning settlements and scalping traders. The British colonies were disjointed, jealous of one another, and utterly incapable of a coordinated defense. In 1754, the British government summoned representatives to Albany, New York, to try and bribe the Iroquois Confederacy into an alliance. Franklin was chosen to represent Pennsylvania. On the road to Albany, Franklin looked at the fractured state of the colonies and despaired. He realized that they were weak because they were divided. He drafted a plan, a radical, visionary plan for a general union of the colonies. He proposed a grand council with representatives from each colony, led by a president general appointed by the king. It would have the power to raise armies, levy taxes, and manage relations with the Indians. To sell the idea, he drew a cartoon in his newspaper, a snake cut into 8 pieces, labeled with the names of the colonies, with the ominous caption, "Join or Die." It was the birth of American political visual culture. The Albany Plan of Union was a masterpiece of statecraft. It was also a total failure. The colonial assemblies rejected it because they didn't want to give up their power to a central council. The king rejected it because he feared it gave the colonies too much power. Franklin would later write that if the Albany Plan had been adopted, the American Revolution might never have happened, because the colonies would have been strong enough to defend themselves without British troops and the taxes that paid for them. It was a missed exit on the highway of history. But the rejection of the Albany Plan revealed a deeper rot in Pennsylvania. The colony was unique. It was a proprietary colony, owned by the descendants of William Penn. The Penn family lived in luxury in London, ruling Pennsylvania like absentee landlords. As the French and Indian War exploded and the frontier burned, the Pennsylvania Assembly tried to tax all land to pay for defense. The Penn family refused to let their vast estates be taxed. They demanded that the poor farmers and tradesmen pay for the war, while they, the lords of the soil, paid nothing. Franklin was incensed. He saw this as a violation of basic British rights. He fought the Penn family's governors in the assembly, using his pen to shred their arguments. The proprietors hated him. They called him a dangerous man, an uneasy spirit. The political deadlock became so severe that the assembly decided they had no choice. They had to send their best man to London to appeal directly to the king and Parliament against the Penn family. In 1757, the 51-year-old Franklin prepared to leave Philadelphia. He was no longer just a printer or a scientist. He was the voice of his people. He packed his bags, taking his son William with him, intending for the young man to study law in London. He left Deborah behind. She was terrified of the ocean and refused to cross it. Franklin told her he would be gone for a season, perhaps a year at most. He had no idea that he was embarking on an odyssey that would keep him away for nearly 2 decades. He had no idea that when he returned, the world would be on fire, and he would be an old man charged with building a new nation from the ashes. As his ship slipped down the Delaware River, leaving the lightning rods of Philadelphia behind, Benjamin Franklin turned his face toward London, the heart of the empire he still loved, unaware that he was sailing into the heart of the storm that would destroy it. When Benjamin Franklin arrived in London in July 1757, he was not the runaway boy who had washed up there 30 years earlier. He was 51 years old, a world-famous scientist, and the most important political figure in America. He moved into a 4-story brick townhouse at 36 Craven Street, just a short walk from the seat of British power at Whitehall. It was meant to be a temporary lodging, a base of operations for his battle against the Penn family, but it became something far more profound. It became his home. For the next 15 years, Franklin lived not as an American outsider, but as a refined British gentleman. He fell in love with London. He loved the coffee houses where he could debate the leading minds of the Enlightenment. He loved the clubs where he could dine on beef and claret. He loved the very rhythm of the imperial metropolis. If you had asked Benjamin Franklin in 1760 what he considered himself, he would not have hesitated. He was a Breton. He believed the British Empire was the greatest force for liberty and civilization the world had ever seen, and he wanted nothing more than for America to be fully integrated into it. But the heart of his life in London was not in the halls of Parliament. It was in the parlor of 36 Craven Street. Franklin found a landlady named Margaret Stevenson, a widow of roughly his own age. They formed a bond that historians have debated for centuries. It was a domestic partnership in every way but legal. Margaret ran the household, shopped for his clothes, and nursed him when he was sick. They were inseparable companions. And then there was her daughter, Polly. Polly Stevenson was a brilliant, inquisitive young woman, and Franklin adored her. He became her mentor, teaching her science and philosophy, treating her with an intellectual respect that few men of that era showed to women. In the warmth of Craven Street, Franklin found the intellectual family he had always craved, a sharp contrast to his life back in Philadelphia. Deborah, his loyal wife, remained thousands of miles away, afraid of the ocean, struggling to manage his affairs, and writing him letters that he often took weeks to answer. While Deborah was fighting off creditors and managing the post office, Benjamin was attending concerts and discussing electricity with lords. It is one of the colder aspects of Franklin's character. He could compartmentalize his heart as easily as he cataloged his library. Amidst this high society living, the inventor in him never slept. In 1761, he attended a concert where a musician played a set of water-filled wine glasses. Franklin was enchanted by the sound, but annoyed by the clumsiness of the setup. He went back to Craven Street and designed a new instrument, a series of interlocking glass bowls of different sizes, mounted on a horizontal spindle that was rotated by a foot pedal. The player would wet their fingers and touch the spinning glass. He called it the glass harmonica. The sound it produced was unearthly, a piercing, ethereal vibration that seemed to come from the air itself. It became a sensation across Europe. Mozart and Beethoven composed music for it. Marie Antoinette took lessons. But it also carried a strange stigma. The vibrating glass was rumored to overstimulate the nerves, causing melancholy or even madness in players. For Franklin, it was his favorite invention. He would sit in the attic of Craven Street, playing his glass bowls for hours, the ghostly music drifting out over the foggy London streets. But while Franklin was lost in his ethereal music, the reality on the ground was about to shatter. That storm broke in 1765. The British government, deeply in debt from the war that had saved the colonies from the French, decided it was time for the Americans to pay their share. Parliament passed the Stamp Act. It was a direct tax on every piece of printed paper in the colonies, legal documents, licenses, newspapers, even playing cards. This was the moment Benjamin Franklin made the biggest mistake of his political life. Living in London, surrounded by aristocrats and imperial bureaucrats, Franklin misread the mood of his own people. He was a pragmatist. He hated the tax, but he believed it was inevitable. He thought the colonies should simply accept it and make the best of it. He even went so far as to nominate his friend, John Hughes, to be the stamp distributor for Pennsylvania. He wrote to a friend back home, "We might as well have hindered the sun's setting. Since we can't save that, let us at least save the candles." He had no idea that he had just lit a fuse. When news of the Stamp Act reached America, the colonies exploded. This wasn't just about money. It was about principle. No taxation without representation. Mobs took to the streets. In Philadelphia, when they heard that Franklin had practically endorsed the tax by appointing a collector, they turned on their hero. A mob gathered, threatening to burn down Franklin's house. Inside, Deborah Franklin, the woman he had left behind, showed her steel. She refused to flee. She barricaded the doors, gathered her guns, and called on her relatives to stand guard. She was ready to shoot anyone who touched her home. The mob, seeing the armed woman in the window, dispersed. In London, Franklin was stunned. He was being called a traitor by his own countrymen. He realized with a jolt of horror that he had lost touch with the American soul. He had become too English, but Franklin was a master of the pivot. He didn't dig in. He changed course. He realized he had to kill the Stamp Act, or his career and the empire would be destroyed. He launched a one-man propaganda campaign. He wrote anonymous essays in British newspapers under pseudonyms like A Virginian or Pacificus, arguing that the tax was foolish and unenforceable. He spent his nights in coffee houses, using his charm to sway merchants, explaining that if the Americans boycotted British goods, the London economy would crash. The climax came in February 1766. Parliament called Franklin to testify. For 4 hours, he stood on the floor of the House of Commons, facing a barrage of 174 questions from the most powerful men in the empire. It was the greatest performance of his life. He didn't apologize. He didn't stutter. He lectured them. When asked if the Americans would ever submit to the Stamp Act, he replied with one word: never. He explained that Americans had once loved the British, but that this tax had destroyed their affection. He was witty, he was firm, and he was brilliant. He painted a picture of a loyal America that was being pushed away by a foolish parliament. The testimony was a sensation. It was printed and read all over London and the colonies. A few weeks later, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. Franklin walked out of the House of Commons a hero. He had saved the empire. In America, the church bells rang. The mob that had wanted to burn his house now toasted his name in taverns. He was the man who saved his country. But it was a fragile victory. In the process of fighting the act, Franklin had seen something ugly in the faces of the British politicians. He saw arrogance. He saw a refusal to treat Americans as equals. And he saw something else, too. His son, William. William Franklin was now the royal governor of New Jersey, a position he had secured with his father's help. During the Stamp Act crisis, William had remained fiercely loyal to the crown, enforcing the hated laws his father was trying to dismantle. The political wedge was being driven between them. As 1766 drew to a close, Franklin felt a sense of relief, but also a foreboding. He had patched the cracks in the empire, but the foundation was shifting. He stayed in London, hoping to cement the reconciliation, hoping to become a kind of ambassador for a united British-American superstate. He didn't know that the repeal of the Stamp Act was just a pause for breath. The British government was not done with America. And the next time they came for the colonies, they wouldn't just bring tax collectors, they would bring soldiers. The repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766 was a mirage. It felt like a victory, a return to the old order of affection between mother and child. But in London, the mood had shifted. The British Parliament was not chastened, it was resentful. They looked at the Americans not as loyal subjects who had made a point, but as ungrateful children who needed to be disciplined. In 1767, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, pushed through a new series of taxes on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The logic was cold. If the Americans wouldn't pay for stamps, they would pay for the very necessities of life. Franklin, still in London, watched with growing dread. The man who saved his country was now helplessly watching it slide toward the abyss. He tried to explain, to mediate, to write rational essays, but the atmosphere in London had turned toxic. He was no longer the celebrated scientist. He was the representative of a rebellious rabble. And back in Boston, the mood was murderous. British troops occupied the city. In 1770, the Boston Massacre left 5 Americans dead in the snow. Franklin was trapped in the middle. The British thought he was too American. The Americans thought he was too British. He needed a way to diffuse the situation. He needed a scapegoat. And in 1772, one fell right into his lap. A mysterious gentleman, history still debates who it was, approached Franklin and handed him a packet of letters. They were private correspondence written by Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts. Hutchinson was an American-born aristocrat, a man Franklin had once worked with. But these letters were damning. In them, Hutchinson urged the British government to crack down on Boston. He wrote that there must be an abridgment of what are called English liberties. He effectively argued that for the empire to survive, the freedoms of Bostonians had to be crushed. Franklin read these letters and saw a golden opportunity. He believed that the king and parliament weren't evil. They were just misinformed by bad advisors like Hutchinson. He thought, if I show the leaders in Boston that it is their own governor, not the British government, who is asking for these harsh measures, they will direct their anger at Hutchinson and forgive London. It was a naive calculation born of his desperate desire to save the empire. He sent the letters to the Speaker of the Massachusetts Assembly with strict instructions. Show them to a few key men. Do not copy them. Do not print them. Franklin, the master of media, should have known better. You cannot light a match in a powder keg and tell it not to explode. The letters were leaked. They were printed in the Boston newspapers. The reaction was apocalyptic. The people of Massachusetts didn't forgive London. They saw a grand conspiracy between the crown and the governor to enslave them. They petitioned for Hutchinson's removal. In London, the fallout was immediate and violent. The British government was furious that private letters had been stolen and published. Accusations flew. Two men, William Whately and John Temple, accused each other of the theft. They met in Hyde Park at dawn with swords. Temple wounded Whately. The gossip in the coffee houses was that they would fight again, and this time one of them would die. Franklin realized he couldn't let men die for his actions. On Christmas Day, 1773, he published a letter in the London newspapers. He confessed, I alone am the person who obtained and transmitted to Boston the letters in question. He had hoped his confession would end the matter. Instead, it made him the target of the entire British establishment. They had been looking for a villain, and now the most famous American in the world had painted a target on his chest. On January 29, 1774, Franklin was summoned to the Privy Council to answer for his actions. The venue was a room in Whitehall known as the Cockpit. The name was fitting. Historically, it had been a pit for fighting roosters. Now, it was a pit for destroying a man. The room was packed. The 35 lords of the Privy Council sat at a long table. The audience included the Prime Minister, Lord North, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was the elite of the British Empire, gathered to watch a blood sport. Franklin entered wearing a suit of spotted Manchester velvet. He did not wear a wig. He stood by the fireplace, his face a mask of stone. His prosecutor was Alexander Wedderburn, the Solicitor General. Wedderburn was a man known for his sharp tongue and his ambition. He didn't just want to win the case, he wanted to destroy Franklin personally. For an hour, Wedderburn unleashed a torrent of abuse. He called Franklin a thief. He called him a liar. He referenced Franklin's own fiction, saying he was a man of three letters, a classical reference to the Latin word fur, meaning thief. He shouted, he pounded the table, he mocked Franklin's scientific achievements. He accused Franklin of conspiring to become the governor of an independent America. He has forfeited all the respect of societies and of men, Wedderburn thundered. The lords of the council, men Franklin had dined with, men he had debated philosophy with, did not stop it. They laughed. They jeered. They treated the humiliation of Dr. Franklin as excellent entertainment. Through it all, Franklin did not move. He did not speak. He did not change his expression. He stood immobile as a statue, as one witness described. But inside that statue, something was dying. The love for England, the belief in imperial unity, the identity of the loyal Briton. It was all being burned away by Wedderburn's acid. He looked at the laughing faces of the aristocracy and realized they would never accept him. They would never respect America. To them, he was just a rebellious colonial servant who needed to be whipped. When the ordeal finally ended, Franklin walked out of the cockpit without a word. He went home to Craven Street. He took off the spotted Manchester velvet suit and hung it deep in his wardrobe. He would not wear it again for a very long time, but he made a silent vow. The next time he wore that suit, he would be signing the death warrant of the British Empire. The punishment was swift. The very next day, a letter arrived firing him from his position as Deputy Postmaster General. It was a financial blow, but the insult was worse. He was now a pariah in London. His friends stopped calling. The newspapers that had once praised him now called him this old snake. But the deepest tragedy was happening 3,000 miles away. While Franklin was fighting for his reputation in the cockpit, his wife, Deborah, was dying in Philadelphia. She had suffered a stroke. For years, she had begged him to come home. She had managed his affairs, fought off his enemies, and waited faithfully while he lived the high life in London. In her final letters, the spelling was broken, the thoughts confused. She just wanted to see her pappy one last time. Franklin had delayed. He always had one more meeting, one more petition, one more reason to stay in London. Deborah passed away in December 1774. Franklin did not receive the news until she was already buried. He had missed the end of her life. The guilt was a heavy, cold stone in his chest. He had sacrificed his marriage on the altar of an empire that had just spat in his face. With Deborah gone and his political dreams in ashes, the last tether binding him to Britain was cut. There was nothing left for him in England now. The war he had tried so hard to prevent was coming. The king had declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion. The peace was over. In March 1775, Benjamin Franklin boarded a ship bound for Philadelphia. He spent the voyage dropping a thermometer into the ocean, measuring the heat of the Gulf Stream one last time, a scientist to the end. But the man who stepped off the boat in America was not the same man who had left. The mediator was gone. The loyalist was dead. The most dangerous man in America had just come home. When Benjamin Franklin stepped onto the Market Street Wharf on May 5th, 1775, the air in Philadelphia tasted different. It wasn't just the humidity, it was the electricity of war. While he had been at sea, staring at the gray waves and mourning his wife, the world had changed. 2 weeks earlier, on a village green in Lexington and a bridge in Concord, British redcoats had fired upon American farmers. The blood had been spilled. The impossible had happened. Franklin was 69 years old. By the standards of the 18th century, he was an ancient man. He had returned home hoping for a quiet retirement, perhaps to sort through his papers and visit Deborah's grave. Instead, he was greeted as a messiah. The delegates of the Second Continental Congress were gathering in Philadelphia, and before he could even unpack his trunks, they elected him as a delegate. The old man wasn't allowed to rest. He was drafted into the revolution. But for Franklin, the political crisis was overshadowed by a personal agony. He had one burning priority upon his return: his son, William. William Franklin was now the royal governor of New Jersey. He was 44 years old, handsome, accomplished, and deeply entrenched in the establishment his father had helped to build. Ben loved him more than any other person on earth. He saw William as an extension of himself, his legacy, his partner, his dear friend. He arranged a meeting. They met at Trevose, a country estate belonging to a friend, Joseph Galloway. It was a warm, pleasant setting for a conversation that would tear a family apart. Ben laid it out clearly. The British government was corrupt. Parliament was tyrannical. The king had rejected their petitions. The only path left was independence. He expected William, his son, his pupil, to nod, to agree, to resign his commission as governor and stand by his father's side. He assumed William's loyalty to him would outweigh his loyalty to a king across the ocean. He was wrong. William looked his father in the eye and refused. "I am a royal governor," he said. "I have taken an oath." To William, his father was the one acting irrationally. Ben was an old man being swept up by a mob of radicals. William believed in law, in order, in the stability of the empire. He told his father he would not resign. He would stay at his post. He would do his duty. The argument grew heated. Voices were raised. The two men who had once flown a kite together in a thunderstorm to catch the secrets of the universe now stood on opposite sides of a moral abyss. Ben stormed out. The bond was snapped. They would never effectively speak as father and son again. In the months that followed, the tragedy deepened. As the war escalated, William didn't just stay neutral. He became a hunter. He organized loyalist networks in New Jersey. He gathered intelligence on the Patriots. He was fighting his father's war, but he was fighting for the enemy. Ben responded with a terrifying coldness. He cut William out of his heart. He threw himself into the work of the Congress with a manic energy. He was the oldest man in the room, 20 years older than Washington, 35 years older than Jefferson. He slept during the long speeches, but in committee, he was a dynamo. He designed a postal system for the army. He sketched designs for currency. He planned the production of gunpowder. He was the master of logistics. And then came the summer of 1776. The Congress decided it was time to put their rebellion into words. They appointed a committee of 5 to draft a Declaration of Independence. The job of writing it fell to the quiet, lanky Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. But the job of refining it fell to Franklin. History gives us a wonderful image of the two men, Jefferson, the sensitive writer, agonizing over every word, and Franklin, the experienced editor, looking over his shoulder. Jefferson had written, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." It was poetic, but it sounded like a sermon. Franklin scratched it out. He suggested a change. "We hold these truths to be self-evident." With that one edit, Franklin shifted the American founding from the realm of religion to the realm of reason. Liberty wasn't a gift from a priest. It was a fact of nature, as obvious as gravity or electricity. On July 4th, 1776, the document was adopted. As the delegates stepped forward to sign their names, signing their own death warrants if the rebellion failed, the mood was grim. The heavy atmosphere needed breaking. John Hancock, the president of the Congress, declared, "We must be unanimous. There must be no pulling different ways. We must all hang together." Franklin, leaning on his cane, quipped, "Yes, we must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." The room erupted in laughter. Once again, Franklin had used wit to chase away fear. But while he was joking about hanging, his son was being hunted. The New Jersey militia, acting on orders from the Congress, a Congress where Ben sat, arrested Governor William Franklin. He was dragged from his home and branded a virulent enemy to this country. Ben could have interceded. He had the power. He could have asked for a house arrest, for leniency. He did nothing. He let them take his son away. William was marched to Connecticut and thrown into the Litchfield jail, a hellhole of a prison. He was thrown into solitary confinement, in a cell with a floor covered in horse manure, denied visitors, denied even paper to write to his wife. William's wife, Elizabeth, was left alone in New Jersey. She was frail and terrified. The stress of her husband's imprisonment broke her. She died of a broken heart while William was rotting in that cell. Benjamin Franklin knew this, and he did not weep. He had replaced his biological family with a new family, his country. It is the darkest stain on his character, a ruthlessness that chills the blood. He sacrificed his son for the Republic. By the autumn of 1776, the war was going badly. George Washington's army was being chased across New York. The British were winning. The Americans had no money, no navy, no gunpowder, and no allies. The revolution was dying in its cradle. The Congress played its last card. They needed a miracle. They needed France. If they could get the French king to supply money and guns, they might survive. But who could convince a Catholic monarch to support a rebellion of Protestant Republicans? Who had the fame, the charm, and the intellect to seduce an entire nation? There was only one man. Franklin was 70 years old. He suffered from gout so severe that he sometimes had to be carried in a sedan chair. He had kidney stones. The voyage across the Atlantic in winter was dangerous. If a British ship caught him, he would be hanged as a traitor. His body was failing. But when the Congress asked, he famously said, "I am old and good for nothing, but as the storekeepers say of their remnants of cloth, I am but a faggot. You may have me for what you please." In October 1776, he secretly boarded a sloop called the Reprisal. He took 2 grandsons with him, William's illegitimate son, Temple, whom Ben had effectively kidnapped emotionally from his father, and his daughter Sally's son, Benny. He was taking the future with him. As the ship slipped into the freezing Atlantic, pursued by British cruisers, Benjamin Franklin prepared for his greatest act. He had conquered electricity. He had conquered the printing press. Now he had to conquer the court of Versailles. He was an old man in a fur cap, sailing to save a country that didn't yet exist. The Atlantic crossing was brutal. The Reprisal was a small, cramped sloop of war, tossed by winter gales and hunted by the Royal Navy. For 30 days, the 70-year-old Franklin endured the freezing damp, his gout flaring so badly he could barely stand. But he used the time. He learned a little French. He measured the temperature of the water, and he planned his performance. When he landed in Brittany in December 1776, the reaction was instantaneous. France didn't just welcome him, it devoured him. To the French, Benjamin Franklin was not a politician. He was a myth made flesh. He was the man who had tamed the lightning. He was the philosopher of the wilderness. He was the symbol of the natural man that Rousseau and Voltaire had written about. The French aristocracy, trapped in their gilded cages of etiquette and powder, looked at Franklin and saw freedom. Franklin knew exactly what they wanted, and he gave it to them. He ditched the powdered wig and the sword that were required for court dress. Instead, he wore a simple brown coat. He wore his spectacles. And most famously, he wore a hat of marten fur. It was a stroke of marketing genius. In the halls of Versailles, surrounded by men in silk and diamonds, the man in the fur cap looked like a prophet from a new world. He set up his residence in the village of Passy, just outside Paris. It quickly became the unofficial American embassy. But it looked more like a salon. He was inundated with visitors. Inventors came with schemes for new weapons. Poets came with odes in his honor. Women, countesses, duchesses, intellectuals, flocked to him. They called him Papa. He flirted with them shamelessly. He wrote them bagatelles, witty, slightly risque essays. He played chess with the Duchess of Bourbon while she sat in her bath. The British ambassador, Lord Stormont, watched all this with horror. He reported back to London that Franklin was seducing the entire nation. "He is the idol of the people," Stormont wrote. "I cannot describe to you the effect he has." But behind the flirting and the chess, Franklin was playing a deadly serious game. His mission was impossible. Convince an absolute monarch, King Louis XVI, to bankroll a Republican revolution against another monarch. He had to prove that the Americans could win. And the news from home was terrible. Washington was losing. New York had fallen. Philadelphia was captured. Every time a ship arrived with bad news, the French courtiers would rush to Passy and ask, "Is it true, Dr. Franklin? Is the cause lost?" Franklin never flinched. When told that General Howe had captured Philadelphia, Franklin smiled and replied, "No, monsieur. I think Philadelphia has captured General Howe." He spun every defeat into a strategic delay. He was the master of spin. But spin couldn't buy gunpowder. He worked in secret with a playwright named Beaumarchais to set up a dummy corporation, Roderigue Hortalez and Company. This fake company funneled millions of livres worth of arms and uniforms to America, pretending it was private trade. Without these shipments, Washington's army would have fought naked and unarmed. Then came the turning point, December 1777. A rumor swept through Paris. The Americans had won a great victory at Saratoga. An entire British army under General Burgoyne had surrendered. Franklin seized the moment. He went to the French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, and laid his cards on the table. "The time for secrecy is over," he said. "Sign a treaty of alliance with us now, or we may be forced to make peace with Britain." It was a bluff, but it worked. On February 6, 1778, France and the United States signed the Treaty of Alliance. It was the first time a foreign power recognized the United States as an independent nation. Franklin had done it. He had brought the superpower of Europe into the war. When he went to court to be formally presented to the king, the crowd was so thick he could barely move. He didn't bow like a courtier. He stood tall. He wore his simple brown suit. It was a visual revolution before the political one. The courtiers wept. They felt they were witnessing the birth of a new era of humanity. But the war dragged on. Years passed. The strain on Franklin was immense. He was surrounded by spies. His own secretary, Edward Bancroft, was a double agent working for the British, copying every letter Franklin wrote and sending it to London in invisible ink. Franklin suspected there were spies, but he didn't care. "I have no secrets," he said. "If the British know what I am doing, perhaps it will frighten them." He was also fighting a war with his fellow American diplomats. John Adams arrived in Paris, and he hated Franklin. Adams was puritanical, stiff, and obsessed with protocol. He was appalled by Franklin's lifestyle. The late mornings, the French mistresses, the laziness. Adams didn't understand that Franklin's laziness, his dinners, his chess games, was where the real work was being done. Franklin was charming the French into keeping the money flowing. Adams was just annoying them. Finally, in 1781, the trap snapped shut at Yorktown. The French fleet, which Franklin had begged for, blockaded the Chesapeake. Washington's army, armed with French muskets, besieged the British. Lord Cornwallis surrendered. The war was effectively over. Now came the peace. Franklin, along with John Adams and John Jay, began negotiations with the British, and here the old man played his final trick. The French wanted to control the peace process. They wanted to limit American expansion, perhaps keeping the U.S. penned east of the Appalachians. Franklin realized the French had their own agenda. So he broke his instructions. He went behind the back of the French foreign minister and negotiated directly with the British. He played the two empires against each other. He told the British, "If you want to pull us away from France, give us a generous peace." And they did. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, was a triumph. Britain recognized American independence and granted the U.S. all the land west to the Mississippi River. It was a massive continental empire. On the day of the signing, Franklin went to his wardrobe. He dug past the brown coats and the fur caps. He pulled out a suit of spotted Manchester velvet. It was the same suit he had worn in the cockpit 9 years earlier when Wedderburn had humiliated him. He put it on. He didn't say a word about it. He just wore it, signed the treaty that destroyed the British Empire in America, and smiled. The debt was paid. The old snake had bitten back. His work was done. He was 79 years old. He wanted to go home. He wrote to Congress, "Let me go. I'm afraid I shall die here." But there was one last piece of business, one last meeting. His son William was in London. He had been released from prison in a prisoner exchange and was living as a refugee. Before leaving Europe, Ben agreed to meet him in Southampton. It should have been a reconciliation. The war was over. They were the only two Franklins left. But the meeting was cold. Ben focused on business. Debts William owed him, land titles. He showed no warmth. William tried to explain his loyalty, but Ben cut him off. He called William's actions unnatural. They parted as strangers. William would die in exile in London, never seeing America or his father again. Ben got back on the ship, turning his back on his son and his old life, sailing west toward the country he had conjured into existence. On September 14, 1785, a sudden pealing of church bells shattered the quiet of Philadelphia. A cannon boomed from the harbor. A crowd of thousands rushed to the Market Street wharf, cheering so loudly they drowned out the cries of the seagulls. Benjamin Franklin had come home. He was 79 years old. He had been away for nearly a decade. He had left as a rebel with a price on his head. He returned as the most celebrated man in the world. But as he stepped off the ship, helped by his grandsons, the crowd saw a man who was physically broken. The gout had stiffened his joints. A massive bladder stone made every movement an agony. He could no longer ride in a carriage because the jolting over cobblestones caused him excruciating pain. He had to be carried in a sedan chair, a box with a seat, lifted on poles by two strong men. He was brought to his home, Franklin Court. It was a strange homecoming. His wife, Deborah, was gone, buried in the Christ Church cemetery. His son William was dead to him, living in exile in London. But the house was not empty. His daughter Sally was there, along with her husband and 7 children. The quiet philosopher's den became a nursery. Franklin, who had dined with kings and queens, now spent his afternoons playing cards with toddlers and teaching them how to read. But the inventor in him could not rest. Even as his body failed, his mind looked for solutions. Frustrated that he constantly had to switch between his reading glasses and his distance glasses, he took the 2 sets of lenses, cut them in half, and glued them together in a single frame. In doing so, he invented bifocals. It was the ultimate Franklin invention. Simple, practical, and born of personal necessity. He also built a long arm, a mechanical claw on a pole, so he could pull books from high shelves without having to climb a ladder. He was an old wizard in his castle, surrounded by his gadgets, hoping to live out his days in peace. However, history had one final assignment for the 81-year-old man. The country he had helped birth would not let him rest. By 1787, the United States was falling apart. The Articles of Confederation, the loose set of rules they had agreed to during the war, were a disaster. The government had no money and no power to tax. States were fighting each other over trade rights. In Massachusetts, farmers had risen up in armed rebellion. The experiment of liberty was on the verge of collapsing into anarchy. A call went out for a convention in Philadelphia to fix the government. The greatest minds in America were summoned: Madison, Hamilton, Washington, and, of course, Franklin. He was 81 years old. He was in constant pain, but he knew that without him, the convention might fail. He was the host, the peacemaker, the grandfather of the Republic. In May 1787, the Constitutional Convention began. The heat in Philadelphia that summer was oppressive. To keep their debates secret, the delegates nailed the windows of the State House shut. Inside, the air was thick, hot, and smelly. Tempers flared. The small states feared the large states would swallow them whole. The large states refused to give up their power. The convention was deadlocked. It seemed impossible that these men could agree on anything. Franklin sat in his chair, often quiet, listening. He was too weak to stand and give long speeches. Instead, he would write out his thoughts and have his colleague, James Wilson, read them aloud. Franklin's role was not to write the Constitution. That was James Madison's job. Franklin's role was to keep the men in the room. Whenever the arguments became too heated, Franklin would intervene with a joke, a story, or a plea for humility. He famously said, "The older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment." He urged the young, fiery delegates to accept that they might not be 100% right. The crisis point came over the issue of representation. The small states wanted equal votes. The big states wanted votes based on population. The convention was ready to break up. Franklin, in a moment of desperation, actually suggested they hire a chaplain to lead them in prayer, hoping God might cool their tempers. The proposal was rejected. Alexander Hamilton reportedly said they didn't need foreign aid, but the gesture showed how close they were to failure. Finally, a committee was formed to find a compromise. Franklin threw his weight behind the Great Compromise, a House of Representatives based on population, and a Senate with 2 votes for every state. It was an imperfect solution. It was messy, but it saved the Union. On September 17, 1787, the final document was ready to be signed. It was not perfect. It kicked the can down the road on terrible issues, particularly slavery. Many delegates were unhappy. 3 refused to sign. Franklin rose to speak one last time. Or rather, James Wilson rose to read Franklin's words. It was the speech of a pragmatist, a man who had seen enough of the world to know that perfection is the enemy of the good. I confess that there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve, the speech began, but I am not sure I shall never approve them. He looked at the men around him and said, "I consent, sir, to this Constitution because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best." He urged them to doubt their own infallibility and sign the document. One by one, inspired by the old man's wisdom, they stepped forward. As the last members were signing, Franklin looked toward the president's chair where George Washington sat. Carved into the back of the high wooden chair was a sun, half hidden by the horizon. Painters often have trouble distinguishing a rising sun from a setting sun. Franklin leaned over to the man next to him and whispered, "I have often, in the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears, looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun." The Constitution was signed. The nation had a framework. Franklin was carried out of the hall in his sedan chair, the job of nation building finally complete. But as he returned to his quiet house, one final battle awaited him. It was a battle not for territory or for laws, but for the soul of America. Throughout the convention, Franklin had been strangely silent on the issue of slavery. He had compromised to keep the southern states in the Union. But in the privacy of his conscience, the old slaveholder had undergone a radical conversion. He knew he had one fight left in him. He knew that a rising sun could not shine on a land of chains. And he decided in his final months to break his silence. The year was 1787. The Constitution was signed. The parades were over. Benjamin Franklin was back in his armchair at Franklin Court, his body ravaged by pain. He took opium to manage the agony of the bladder stone, spending his days in a haze of drowsy reflection. Most men would have let go. They would have been content to die as the father of the country. But Franklin had a guilty conscience. For much of his life, Franklin had been complicit in the institution of slavery. He had owned household slaves. He had run advertisements in his newspaper for the sale of human beings. He had profited from the very system that his Enlightenment philosophy claimed to despise. But over the decades, his views had shifted. He had visited a school for black children and was struck by their intelligence, realizing that their condition was a result of environment, not nature. He had listened to his Quaker friends, and now, staring at death, he realized that his work was unfinished. He could not leave a legacy of liberty while remaining silent on the greatest tyranny of all. He became the president of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. It was not a ceremonial role. In February 1790, just 2 months before his death, Franklin signed a petition to the new United States Congress. It was a bombshell. He called for the federal government to step to the very verge of the power vested in you for discouraging every species of traffic in the persons of our fellow men. He was asking the new government to commit itself to the eventual end of slavery. The reaction was explosive. Southern congressmen were furious. James Jackson of Georgia took to the floor of the House and attacked Franklin personally, claiming that the Bible justified slavery and that the economy would collapse without it. They told the old man to shut up and die. Franklin's response was his final masterpiece. He was too sick to go to Congress, so he reached for his pen. He wrote a letter to the editor of the Federal Gazette. It was a satire, written in the voice of a fictional Algerian pirate named Sidi Mehemet Ibrahim. In the letter, the pirate defends the practice of enslaving white Christians, using the exact same arguments that the Southern congressmen had used to defend enslaving Africans. If we cease our cruises against the Christians, the pirate argues, who, in this hot climate, are to cultivate our lands. It was brilliant, biting, and hilarious. Franklin stripped the mask off the Southern defense of slavery, showing it to be nothing but naked greed and hypocrisy. He published it on March 23, 1790. It was the last thing he ever wrote for the public. The man who had started his career pretending to be a widow named Silence Dogood ended it pretending to be a pirate, using humor to speak the truth that no one else dared to whisper. 3 weeks later, the end came. On April 17, 1790, Benjamin Franklin lay in his bed. An abscess in his lung had burst. Breathing was a struggle. His daughter, Sally, told him to change his position so he could breathe more easily. The old philosopher looked at her and whispered his final words. "A dying man can do nothing easy." At 11 o'clock that night, the pulse stopped. The man who had been the nervous system of the colonies, the spark of the revolution, and the conscience of the republic was gone. When the news broke, Philadelphia stopped. The shops closed. The ships in the harbor lowered their flags. The funeral, held 3 days later, was the largest gathering the city had ever seen. 20,000 people, artisans, bankers, sailors, and scientists, lined the streets. The bells of the city, which he had rung to celebrate victories and warn of fires, now tolled for him. But even from the grave, Franklin had one last message to send. When his will was read, the lawyers came to the section regarding his son William, the son who had chosen the king over his father, the son who had let his own wife die of heartbreak while he sat in a prison cell. Everyone wondered if Ben had forgiven him in the end. He had not. The will was brutal in its precision. He left William almost nothing, some land in Nova Scotia that was virtually worthless, and the books that were already in William's possession. And then he added a sentence that would echo through history. "The part he acted against me in the late war, which is of public notoriety, will account for my leaving him no more of an estate he endeavored to deprive me of." It was the final act of the first American. He had chosen his country over his blood. He was a man of contradictions. He was a runaway who became a pillar of the establishment. He was a proud Briton who destroyed the British Empire. He was a slave owner who became an abolitionist. He was a man who preached the virtue of frugality but died one of the richest men in America. But it is in these contradictions that we find his true genius. He was not a marble statue of perfection like Washington. He was made of flesh, humor, and flaws. He was the first person to define what it meant to be an American. He showed us that an American is someone who invents themselves, someone who believes that the world is not fixed, but malleable, that with enough ingenuity, enough hard work, and enough community spirit, we can fix the roads, we can tame the lightning, and we can build a more perfect union. He taught us that the most dangerous weapon in the world is a printing press. He taught us that compromise is not a weakness, but the very cement of democracy. And he taught us that even when the sky is dark and the storm is raging, if you have the courage to fly a kite, you might just catch the fire of the gods. Today he lies in the Christ Church burial ground in Philadelphia, next to his wife Deborah. Visitors throw pennies onto his grave, a tribute to his famous maxim, "A penny saved is a penny earned." But they are missing the point. Benjamin Franklin didn't save his pennies. He spent them. He spent his money, his energy, his genius, and his heart on the creation of a new world. The sun that he saw on the back of Washington's chair is still rising. And as long as it shines, the shadow of Benjamin Franklin will be cast long across the history of human freedom.